Good morning. My name's Jan Oyebode. I'm a Professor of Dementia Care at University of Bradford, and I'm delighted to be here and to be able to contribute to this really innovative and exciting dementia fiction festival. Before I moved to Bradford, I worked in training health and social care professionals for dementia care. And almost inevitably, people came with negative attitudes and opinions, which they'd absorbed over the years. And of course, empathy is really important for good dementia care. Probably, it's very important in all our relationships, and it's very important for those who work in care roles to have empathy with people. But it's perhaps particularly important when relating with people with a diagnosis of dementia. And what I found in training was that direct experience, of course, made a huge difference, but that for people who didn't have direct experience, fiction was often one way to start to engender that sense of empathy and to change attitudes that people had. So in this talk, what I hope to do is to talk a little bit about how dementia is portrayed in fiction and to think about how that influences our attitudes and the impact this has on people living with dementia, family members, and society in general, including all the health and care professionals who work with people with dementia. I'm going to start by talking about portrayals of dementia in children's fiction. And I think this is really important because our attitudes get embedded so early in life, and stories play a very big part in young children's understanding of the world beyond their family. So I'm going to begin with a short story, and I'm going to tell you an abridged version of Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge. So if you're all sitting comfortably, let me just tell this short tale. There was once a small boy called Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge. And what's more, he wasn't very old either. His house was next door to an old people's home, and he knew all the people who lived there. He liked Mrs. Jordan, who played the organ. He listened to Mr. Hosking, who told him scary stories. He played with Mr. Tippett, who was crazy about cricket. He ran errands for Miss Mitchell, who walked with a wooden stick. And he admired Mr. Drysdale, who had a voice like a giant. But his favourite person of all was Miss Nancy Alison Delacourt Cooper, because she had 4 names, just like he did. He called her Miss Nancy, and he told her all his secrets. One day, Wilfred Gordon heard his mother and father talking about Miss Nancy. Poor old thing, said his mother. Why is she a poor old thing? Asked Wilfred. Because she's lost her memory, said his mother. It isn't surprising. After all, she is 96. What's a memory? Asked Wilfred Gordon. He was always asking questions. It's something you remember, said his father. But Wilfred Gordon wanted to know more. So he called on Mrs. Jordan, who played the organ. What's a memory, he asked. Something warm, my child, something warm. He called on Mr. Hoskin, who told him scary stories. What's a memory, he asked. Something from long ago, my lad, something from long ago. He called on Mr. Drysdale, who had a voice like a giant. What's a memory, he asked. Something as precious as gold, young man, something as precious as gold. So Wilfred Gordon went home again to look for memories for Miss Nancy, because she'd lost her own. He looked for the shoebox of shells he'd found long ago last summer and put them gently in a basket. He found his football, which was as precious as gold. And on his way to Miss Nancy's, he went into the hen house and took a fresh, warm egg from under a hen. Then Wilfred Gordon called on Miss Nancy and gave her each thing, one by one. "What a dear, strange child to bring me all these wonderful things," thought Miss Nancy. And then she started to remember. She held the warm egg and told Wilfrid Gordon about the tiny speckled eggs she'd once found in a bird's nest in her aunt's garden. She put a shell to her ear and remembered going to the beach by tram long ago and how hot she felt in her button-up boots. She bounced the football to Wilfrid Gordon and remembered the day she'd met him and all the secrets they'd told. And the two of them smiled and smiled because Miss Nancy's memory had been found again by a small boy who wasn't very old either. So that story is one that I've used to read to clinical psychology trainees when I've wanted to talk with them about the power of memory and the power of reminiscence work and the power of artifacts, objects to trigger our memories. And actually, from a clinical psychology perspective, it's a very accurate representation of how memory works. It's also a feel-good story, and it's quite moving, and it's got a happy ending. You'll notice it doesn't explicitly mention dementia or Alzheimer's disease, but it very strongly associates memory loss with very old age. And it shows an affinity between an old person and someone of a younger generation. So when I was preparing for this talk today, I found this paper by Liz Caldwell from Lancaster, very interesting. And she's looked across 10 picture books for children at the way they depict dementia. And she finds across these picture books a number of the themes that do come up in Wilfrid Gordon MacDonald Partridge. So she suggests that the texts have been mainly written to explain to children and to reassure. And it set me thinking about, why are the books for adults written? And I know that there are authors taking part in this conference, and it would be interesting to reflect on why we do involve people with dementia in books for adults. She also suggests that the strong association between dementia and very old age is included because she hypothesizes that it removes some of the fear that children might have because it makes the memory loss remote from the child. So in some ways that might be emotionally helpful, but in other ways it might be problematic because it reinforces the division between us and them. It puts up a wall between the child and the old person and says, don't worry about this, it can't happen to you. Whereas of course dementia can happen to any of us. She also notices that books for children tend to have what she calls mechanistic explanations of what's happening in the brain. So they use a lot of metaphor, and they might talk of brain problems being tangles like weeds in a garden, or they might talk about a fog obscuring memory. And they tend to imply a loss of self, which it's interesting that they have these metaphors about the brain, but it could be problematic that they imply that the person is vanishing, because we know that the person inside has a sense of self, no matter how severe cognitive problems are. They also often use non-conformity as a link between the older person who's struggling with cognitive problems and the young person, often a grandchild. So, for example, you might have a child with mismatched clothing and a very old person who's getting muddled, who has mismatched clothing. One of the things I like about Wilfrid Gordon MacDonald Partridge is that the similarity is in their names. It's not an attribute to do with how people behave. It's something to do with what they're called. And she also suggests that, or she finds that a lot of the novels for children show progression of dementia. And of course, dementia is usually a progressive condition, but they often show a very clear pre-post narrative that before dementia, the older person is portrayed as a usual older person, but then they get a diagnosis and they become sad and stooped. So they show this pre-post division as if the person changes when they get the diagnosis. But paradoxically, they also show still the same narrative and a happy ending. And the child is often shown as the memory, or as activating the memory of the person with dementia. So these themes that Caldwell finds, a lot of which are found in a novel I read out, the short story I read out to you, she concludes reflects children's books as being, and I've put the quote on the screen here, complex texts which employ often ageist tropes of decline in the depiction of dementia, and yet at the same time support a narrative of ongoing personhood. So why focus on children's books to start this talk? Well, as I mentioned, I think they're so important because at this early period, we're laying down attitudes which form a bedrock throughout our lives. And for young children, they are a key source of information. A lot of us may have grown up on Disney stories of princesses or girls who get married to a prince and live happily ever after, etc. The image that I've put on the screen here is an image connected to research conducted in the States on attitudes to race. And some studies were carried out back in the 40s with black and white children in America who were given black and white dolls to play with and then asked questions about the dolls. And it shows how these attitudes are set down early in life. So they found that children as young as 8 ascribed positive attributes to the white dolls, but negative attributes to the black dolls. And when the black children were asked which doll looked most like them, they identified the black dolls, but they looked very sad about it because all these negative attributes were already ascribed to the black dolls. Now, of course, that's taking place in America, and it's a long time ago, although this image comes from an article on The Conversation, which is an online newspaper, and that's about a repeat of that earlier study by a Black American woman who's conducted this in the last couple of years and still finds that these negative attitudes are pervasive in America. So we have to wonder about how stories about dementia embed ideas in the minds of children about what dementia it is and how that affects us as we take forward our lives. We've done some work at Bradford exploring the perceptions of children and young people about dementia. And we're currently still analysing the findings around the primary school children who took part. But we have involved over 250 children at secondary school and talked with them about dementia. And we find, for example, that these children are unaware that people with dementia may experience problems wider than memory difficulties. They do view dementia as very strongly associated with age, and they have a lot of negative impressions of dementia. So they know there's no medical cure, but their image seems to be one of advanced dementia. They feel that people with dementia need to live in care homes and that people with dementia live in loneliness and pain and can't be very happy. And they think that people with dementia can't maintain a good quality of life. So we see how these negative attitudes are laid down early on I'm just concluding this little section about early attitudes and how they're laid down. I couldn't resist putting up these images from the Disney film Coco, which I watched with grandchildren recently, which has like a subplot on the relationship between the very elderly Mama Coco and the very young Miguel. And a bit as in Wilfred Gordon, Miguel helps Mama Coco to remember important people from her childhood. And there's shown a lot of affection shown between them. So turning to adulthood, let's think about the process behind formation of these attitudes that we have. So when we know people well, we see them as individuals. We see them as individuals first and in different classes or categories second. So when I see my neighbour, I think of all sorts of things about my neighbour, but I think of them as Sue, the person she is. I don't think, you know, here's a white middle-class person, therefore she must think this, that, and the other. But when we have categories of people we haven't met, then the information we have about them comes from external sources, and it's selective information. It's either selected for us by, for example, the media, or we select it. And we see certain attributes and we organise these around the construct. And then when we meet someone from that category, we put these ideas upon them. So I have put here some of the newspaper headlines about immigration as an example. So you can see the selected messages that, in this case, Express readers would be reading, and the sorts of ideas they convey about people who immigrate to the UK. Very much a partial picture. It doesn't mention that people who've immigrated to the UK keep our health and social care system going. It doesn't mention that on average, people who immigrate to the UK contribute much more to society than they take out of it. But it portrays people who immigrate to the UK as sponging and as pinching the rights of people who live in the UK. So with those negative ideas, when someone who's an immigrant moves in next door to you, you expect them to fulfill these negative ideas that you've developed. How does this play out then in dementia? So here are some UK newspaper headlines Googled the other day when I was preparing this talk, and you can see some of the messages on them. So you can see that people with dementia are seen as being tortured, are seen as suffering, are seen as being miserable. And you can see dementia portrayed as a terrible threat. There are risks lying around every corner. In these newspaper articles, it's a risk from sleeping tablets. And you can see that people with dementia are posing a crisis for society in general. And that actually, if we do have dementia, we are going to be vulnerable and we're going to receive shocking care. So a lot of negative messages which don't set us up well if we are suspecting we have dementia or if we're given a diagnosis. And when I Googled images for dementia, I got more images from charitable sector sites. And again, they're interesting images. They're not as designed to be as emotionally provocative as the newspaper headlines. And some are now about umbrellas, which they wouldn't have been a few years ago, to show that dementia is an umbrella term. But most are about the brain, and they do very much play into ideas about you losing yourself. So you can see one in the middle there where the person's brain is being rubbed out with an eraser. Or we have the one in the bottom corner where there are cogs flying off, really playing into the common metaphor of having a screw loose. So associating dementia with mental problems. And again, Googling people with dementia, we see this as a range of images. So the images tend to show people being anxious, scared, or receiving care. So there aren't any images here around independence or enjoying life. So with these images as one of our main sources of ideas about dementia, if we don't have day-to-day contact with people with dementia, you can see that our notion of a person with dementia involves all these negative attributes. And then we transfer those onto someone we meet who has dementia. So all the people on the right-hand side of this slide are people who write in the Dementia Diaries, which some of you may know, which are a type of online community of people who put up posts on a regular basis about life with dementia. And you can see that those people are happy-looking people. They could be a cross-section of any set of people, mainly middle-aged to older. But when we meet one of those people, we assume that behind that exterior, the person must be confused, disappearing, dependent, feel neglected, feel tortured. So what about the role of fiction then? So I think that obviously all journalism isn't bad or inaccurate or negative, and all fiction isn't good or balanced. But I think fiction is in a really unique position for being able to engender empathy. So I would like to think that a body of fiction can help to correct this negative bias that we all tend to have laid down by some of the sources that bring facts about dementia to our minds. And fiction, of course, can be a very hard watch for people directly affected by dementia, which isn't surprising. But for people who are training to go and work with those with dementia, for members of the public, for members of families, it can be a source of insight. It can help us understand what it is like, and it can put us in the shoes of people with dementia. So in the following slides, I've taken some opinions and ideas from people living with dementia as a starting point to illustrate a few issues about what's portrayed in fiction, how it comes across to people living with dementia, and how it may impact upon the public and on health and care professionals. And to inform my talk today, I wrote to a couple of people I know who live with dementia, Keith Oliver and Wendy Mitchell. I think Wendy might be involved later today, or at least Anna. I know Anna Wharton's involved, and Anna has done a lot of consultancy work with Wendy to inform her novel, The Imposter. I also sent via Claire Mason at our centre a message to our experts by experience from the University of Bradford. And again, I think Davy is here today and contributing this afternoon. So that's another nice connection through the dementia world. And I delved into the Dementia Diaries. And from all the responses that people gave, I tried to abstract some dimensions that came across as important to people. So I'm going to talk a bit about accuracy and the notion of accuracy within fictional accounts. And then I'm going to talk a bit about detail and breadth and the balance of good and bad, and how these can be highlighted in fictional accounts. And I'll deal with those areas together. So, thinking about accuracy, I suppose in terms of accuracy, I don't necessarily mean factual accuracy. Novels aren't written to be medical textbooks, but I mean a type of experiential accuracy. I think a lot of the thinking of people living with dementia about fictional accounts is that they feel connected with an account when you see yourself echoed within it. And a lot of accounts, a lot of fictional accounts, have tended to focus on later stages of dementia. And here, Wendy talks about her positive feelings about Still Alice, because it captures the true picture from pre-diagnosis instead of portraying the end. On the Dementia Diarists website are a lot of reviews of films and novels. And there have been some reviews of Supernova, which is a film about a gay couple where one has dementia. And Keith in Sheppey describes in his review a particular incident which he connects with. And I'll just read you what he says. He says, the next thing that I noticed was when we're on the road trip was that Sam, who's the partner without dementia, was talking to Tusker, the partner with dementia, about anything and everything. Tusker, he just sat there looking out the window in a world of his own. And then it's something I realised I've done many times. What you do, you tend to isolate yourself, and for no reason at all, and especially when someone that loves you is talking to you and you don't have the decency to answer them back. So in that incident, Keith saw himself. He said, yes, it's describing there something that I do. And actually, he almost gives the impression that he's not reflected on that much before until he's seen it in the film. So we see how the film has engendered reflection in him. And that sense of affinity, that's me, maybe helps to give him his overall view of the film. And as I've put on the slide here, he says, I've never found something that was so emotional as that film. It's so direct. It shows dementia as it is, the highs and the lows. So that seems quite a powerful recommendation. Just also thinking about this aspect of accuracy, another one of the Dementia Diarists, Wayne, has put up a good review of The Father. And in The Father, he comments on what it shows about carers, and he finds that comes across to him as an accurate representation. He says, it's very much a shame, but probably true to life, that he was surrounded by people who had no idea about dementia and were making the situation far, far worse because of their lack of understanding. So he is suggesting that family members might find the father helpful, even though it's harrowing, because it may help them understand something about their part in supporting a relative with dementia. So what's missing in the panoply of literature, fictional literature about dementia in terms of giving us accurate reflections? Well, there's so much literature coming out that I imagine what the experts by experience that we consulted know about probably isn't the whole sweep of it, and I'm sure I don't know the whole sweep of it at all. But someone did mention, when will any fictional representation ever feature cognitive issues other than memory? I see things which aren't there. G can't judge distances. F can't smell things. And these are common symptoms no one seems to know or care much about. And this is an example of real power from people with dementia, because these aspects around sensory perception weren't talked about or really even known about much by professionals until Agnes Houston, who lives with dementia, collected experiences and wrote this book, Talking Sense, which is available free through the internet, and which highlights the sensory issues that people with dementia can have when their brain reacts differently to sound and sense and so on. Interestingly, when I was thinking about, is this actually missing or not, one of the things I wondered was whether we get an overshadowing within literature, that the memory problems overshadow the other issues, and maybe they are actually there and portrayed. And I thought of the paragraph which I saw Jane use in a talk of hers, which I listened to, that's available online. And she uses a paragraph from Elizabeth is Missing to illustrate some points about narrative. But that paragraph also illustrates something interesting about sensory perception in dementia. And the paragraph says, "When I open my door, I can hear a roaring noise. I can't think what it is. It gets louder the further down the stairs I go. I stop on the bottom step, but I can't see anything. I look in the sitting room. The roaring's even louder. I wonder if it's in my head, if something's coming loose. The noise swells and vibrates, and then it stops." And actually, the noise turns out to be the Hoover. And I suppose not many of us would think of the Hoover as being so loud that it's a really frightening roaring. But in dementia, some people get what's known as hyperacusis, which is like a super sensitive sensory response. And so something that might be quite an innocuous noise to one person, to some people with dementia does come across very loudly. And that is well echoed, well described in that paragraph of Elizabeth is Missing. What else might be missing across the range of literature? Well, Wayne, in his review of Supernova, talks about posh dementia. And he suggests that the characters in posh dementia are people who we might not relate to as ordinary people, as the people next door. So his implication is that we still need a wider range of stories about wider and more diverse people, whether that's diverse by culture, ethnicity, class, living circumstances. So there's plenty of room, I think, for more novels to expand on experience. One of our experts by experience gave quite an interesting writing tip, and I don't know what those of you listening would think about this, suggesting in film, writers tend to try to be in a hurry to rush us from diagnosis to end of life. In books, there's more scope to take more time to go into greater explanation and detail. I would prefer if authors would just choose part of the story to tell, as this would allow for more accuracy. And it made me think in my mind of all the potential of short stories to show small incidents in depth, and how those small little vignettes can be really helpful. And I suppose poetry too can be really helpful in this way. Accuracy, of course, in terms of experiential accuracy, can result from consulting with people with dementia. And I think true involvement can be really helpful. A lot of people who write about dementia, I think, do have personal experience within their family and maybe draw on that as they write. And a lot of writers must do a lot of research into the area to make sure that what they're putting across is plausible. And here there's a quote from Wendy talking about the role she's had as a consultant to Leeds Playhouse as they adapted Still Alice for the stage play. And one of the things I really loved about going on their website was seeing Wendy referred to in the production team as a consultant, because it gives proper value and credence to that expertise that people with dementia have in their own lives. So I suppose when I'm looking out for literature to draw to the attention of trainees or people who ask me what they can read to learn about dementia, I would be wanting to bear in mind these dimensions of around experiential accuracy. and suggesting those books and novels and films which have that quality from the point of view of people with dementia. So one of the other areas that people with dementia talked about as important was balance. And we know that dementia is a really difficult diagnosis to have. And we know that it means that you're going to be coping with very difficult times. The Alzheimer's Society commissioned a poll some while ago to find out what people across the country thought and felt about dementia. And the results showed that almost 2/3 of people were frightened about the prospect of having dementia, and more people were frightened of developing dementia than they were of dying. So it was seen by 2/3 of the respondents that dementia was worse than death. And maybe that's not surprising, given the portrayals in the media and that process of organisation of understanding of dementia that goes on in our minds. But we know that reality isn't like that. And Suzanne Carhill and colleagues back in 2004 did a survey of people living with mild to moderate dementia about their opinion of living with dementia, and found that 2/3 of those people reported a good quality of life. So the experience of people with dementia is at odds with the view that we have. And maybe fictional narratives can show light and shade, and they can show that there are upsides as well as downsides, and they can show the sort of hope that we all need to live with dementia, but also genuinely that, as this expert by experience from Bradford says, there can be a lot of light and laughter and singing and puns. Wendy also brought out the importance of portraying humour as part of the overall experience of dementia when she was talking about her involvement with Leeds Playhouse. And she says that I helped advise Sharon Small, who played Still Alice in the theatre. I wanted to make sure they had a humour element in the play, which was lacking in the film. And interestingly, in recent academic work, having a laugh has come out as one of 13 key outcomes that people with dementia would like to see from supportive interventions. And I don't think if we'd asked professionals, they'd have highlighted humour or having a laugh as important. And it's maybe important to everyone in life, but it seems to be an integral part of dementia for many people and of coping with dementia for many people. And this relates perhaps to retention of self and those fictional portrayals which show the self as retained feel valuable in counterbalancing some of the dominant images and narratives which show the self as floating away into the air as you have dementia. In Out of Mind, this is a first-person narrative, and the protagonist has difficulty with communication and eventually finds it very hard to make himself understood, but he still has his language in his own mind. And he coins this metaphor around interpretation. He says, the thought of an interpreter doesn't occur to them, the people around him. I'm the sole survivor of my own language. So this is a portrayal of quite advanced dementia from the first person perspective, and it shows the sense of self being retained later in dementia, which is quite a valuable lesson to learn and quite a valuable notion to take on board if you're going to be caring for people who do have more advanced dementia. And I think there's quite a lot of work which shows how creativity as part of self is not only retained in dementia, but may be released. And earlier in life, we may be, or if we don't have dementia, I should say, we may be too self-conscious to really allow ourselves to show our creativity to others. But in dementia, when people are often focusing more on the instant than thinking ahead and thinking back, people are often able to tune into their own feelings and the environment around them. And you only have to go to the Dementia Creatives website to see this in action. So a message about retention of self seems to be helpful, and looking for novels or accounts that show this, I think, is a good thing when thinking about what to advise people to read. Something else that comes in terms of balance is that fiction can reflect the seldom said, but it can reflect it in a way that embeds it as part of a whole picture. So the newspaper headlines necessarily often focus narrowly on one aspect of negativity, but in some novels, they can reflect both the rough and the smooth. And one of my favourite novels about living with dementia is The Last Days of Ptolemy Gray by Walter Mosley, which I picked up not because I was looking for a novel about dementia, but I picked it up because I like Walter Mosley's detective crime novels. And I realised it was about the last days of someone, and I bought this book. And I think it's a fantastic portrayal of a very old man, in this case, with dementia, but it highlights the difficult aspects as well as the other more positive aspects, like the retention of self. And I was going to read you a bit about the smell that's portrayed, as in it stinks too much in here. So Ptolemy Gray lives alone, and he's been trying to keep himself going, but there's a lot of self-neglect portrayed. And his grandnephew, Hilly, visits, and he says, "What's that smell?" Hilly asked. "What smell? I don't smell nothing." It's bad." Hilliard Bernard Brown moved a stack of Ptolemy's metal folding chairs that were leaning against the bathroom door. "Don't go in there," Ptolemy said. "That's my bathroom, that's private." But the bulbous young man didn't listen. He moved the chairs aside and went into the small bathroom. "The toilet's all stopped up, Papa Gray," Hilly said, holding his broad hand over nose and mouth. "How can you even breathe in here? How do you go to the toilet?" So this is something that's not easily mentioned, and it is come across. And people working in the community may need to go out into individuals' homes where individuals have been left alone without support and are trying to look after themselves and having trouble. And by reading a novel like this, you can see that sort of issue in a much broader context. And when you're working with healthcare professionals, you can talk about this and how they're going to manage it if it happens, what they're going to say, and how they're going to bring it out into the open and discuss it with someone and how to get around it. And another taboo area is thinking about sex. Hence my quote here, "It's a shame, the feeling I got for you." And our protagonist, Ptolemy Gray, forms a friendship with a young 17-year-old who's a tremendous help to him, and they have a real affinity, and she comes around and she does a lot in his life, including clearing up his flat. And she's very young and attractive, and she's very free and easy about the way she is. And she says to him at this point, "Are you looking at my legs, Uncle?" Robin asked coyly. And Robin says, and Ptolemy says, "I guess so. Are you a dirty old man, Uncle?" And he says, "No, but you sure do remind me of something." "What's that?" Robin shifted on the bed, but she didn't hide her legs. "Cover them things up, girl," he said. "You know I'm an old man, but I still remember how much a girl can hurt you. I'm past 90, but that don't mean you could play with me like that." So again, I've used this in talking with trainees who maybe take on board the idea that if you have dementia, you're somehow sexless. And we have a lot of referrals when I worked in clinical practice from the care home sector, where people with dementia had sexual feelings or sexual attractions or sexual behaviour, and the care home wasn't sure how to react towards it. But if we can take novels which show it as a natural thing that people with dementia retain as much as anyone else retains, then we can normalise it, and we can help to engender understanding. So I'm rolling towards the end now, and I just wanted to recognise that, of course, as people living with dementia said to me in their responses, a lot of novels and films about dementia can be a hard watch if you have dementia. Here's Wendy talking about Still Alice and how she was left with a feeling of helplessness and inevitability in the pit of her stomach because of the power and accuracy of the film. So it's not everyone's cup of tea. Chris Higgins, another of the dementia diarists, talks about how it may be worth going through distress to get better understanding. And he talks about that in relation to family members. So he says in his review of The Father that it's heartrending. And he says, we have the family carers who are hit with it and don't really have an idea of what's going on. So it's really good for them to go and watch it. It would be heartrending for them to sit through that, but they would try and get their heads round and understand. And he often says, giving the ordinary people that sort of insight will help them. So a hard watch particularly for those with dementia, but a hard watch for others too, but maybe worthwhile. Just waiting for my clicker to reconnect so I can get us on to the next slide. So I want to read to you a poem that Keith Oliver wrote back in March about the fact that stories about dementia tend not to come to a happy ending. And he says, I dream of being a big screen hero riding off into the sun, mission accomplished, deeds complete, battles fought and always won. In TV drama or in film, it never ends well for us. Soap opera, documentary, it always was thus. We're portrayed as someone to feel pity for, or maybe even step away in fear. At best, to seek elusive ways for us to hold on to memories we held as dear. The storyline unfolds, the character declines, into the mists of dementia they fall, and the audience accepts as you would accept. We depart before our curtain call. Would an actor win awards stepping into our shoes if the portrayal showed them living well? I'll leave that for you to suppose. So there's a good challenge for people to be able to produce a fictional account that shows some of the positives of dementia and the fact that people with dementia can have a contented life, a fulfilling life. It's not necessarily full of misery. And one of the Bradford experts by experience suggests that we should preface films and novels about dementia with a warning of the content so that people can choose whether or not to proceed. But, in terms of the positives, another expert by experience explains here that her mum, who has young onset dementia, said she feels really excited and happy when she sees dementia on TV because she feels connected to these people and less isolated. And Dory here talks about a real moment of connection and a conversation with her daughter on the way out from seeing the father that she might not have had if they hadn't gone together to see the film. When her daughter says, "You'll never forget me, will you, Mum?" And I said, "Well, I may do, I may not. But if I do, I'll never forget you're in my heart and that I love you." So just to conclude, And I hope in this talk I've been able to show something about the particularly powerful place of fictional accounts of the lives of people with dementia, and how when those are experientially accurate, they can really perhaps act as a counterbalance and a point to change some of the negative ideas we absorb in society and foist on ourselves if we have a diagnosis, or others foist on us. And let me give final words to people living with dementia. Julie, who has young onset dementia, says there's a need for a wide variety of aspects of dementia to be shown in the range of films and dramas being produced, as no one film can do it all, and there's a need for variety. And one of our experts by experience says, the higher the profile, the more understanding there'll be around the world into this disease. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we have 10 minutes, and I'm happy to discuss with you any of the points made or hear your comments on what I've said. Thank you. So I'm going to peer at this. Yes, go on. I can. They're quite small print, so I'm going to put my nose on the screen. So Ian says it's interesting about knowing a sense of self inside remains. Could you say a little more? And Kristin says, after your comments on the images used by charities, I'm wondering what sort of images would work better. Yeah. Yes, the sense of self inside. It's almost very hard for us to know when someone has trouble communicating how they feel about themselves inside. So we're really looking as researchers, as clinicians, or as relatives, we're looking very much for small signs, non-verbal signs of connection. But I think we often find, people will often tell you about the occasional moment when there's a real sense that someone with very severe cognitive problems has a lot more going on inside their head than they can easily convey in words anymore. So I think it's those glimmers, those magic moments that tell us that people with dementia may have lost ability to communicate verbally when their dementia is severe. They may not be able to put things into words or remember backwards or forwards, but you're there with your range of emotions. And on some occasions, you can connect in a more conventional way with words. But maybe one of the ways we can have connection is through touch, through music, through some of the more symbolic ways of communicating. It's those glimmers that help to tell us that happens. So thinking of Kristin's question, in terms of images, it is very difficult. And I've heard it said that one of the reasons that children's authors show people with dementia as very old and wrinkled is because they're looking for a physical analogy of what it is for your brain not to be working well. And I suppose those images of bits of the brain flying away are doing just the same thing, aren't they? They're trying to find like a metaphor to show what it may feel like to have a brain that's not working well. So it's hard to know what sort of images to use if you want to portray the lived experience of confusion. And Wendy has spoken in her blog and with us when we're doing co-research about having a tangle, like having a tangled thread of beads, a tangled necklace that you can't straighten out. And I thought that was quite a nice abstract metaphor that was different from one that engenders the fear of your brain flying away, because it's more something that, a lot of us have experienced, trying to get a knot out of something. And a lot of us might feel that sometimes we can solve knotty problems. So perhaps showing a knotty problem or a tangle might be an analogy that could be used. But also sometimes if you go on a website and you turn to the pages that are about activities, you see pictures of people with dementia. I remember seeing one of a guy called Peter Berry, who does a lot of cycling to raise money for dementia. And it's just a picture of him cycling, and it doesn't show him being disabled, it shows him empowered. And why shouldn't we show people with dementia who are empowered and busy? Why shouldn't we show Keith on a conference platform addressing an international audience? I know that when you do that, there's the risk that people will say, well, what's this dementia all about? That person can't have it. But I think we have to challenge the stereotypes. So maybe some of these active, engaged, empowered images can also be motivating and can be showing that side of dementia that's not often shown and can counterbalance. I hope that addresses part of what you were interested in. Any other comments people have or any reactions? Okay. I'll wait a moment and see if there's anything else. I don't know if there are people living with dementia in the audience who would like to say anything or comment anything, or educators, of course. Yeah, that's fine. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I think it's a really exciting programme going forward today. So I hope that you all enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll say goodbye to you for now.